Want to talk? So let's talk. Yeah. Talk. You want to talk? You gotta talk. You need to talk. News talk.
I talk, you talk to Solomon. I talk, you talk to Solomon. Yeah, let's talk to Solomon. Talk to Solomon.
Welcome back. It's the Stan Solomon Show. Lots of action, lots of action. Our good friend, Dr. Alan Keyes, is our guest of honor. Brent Johnson is with us from Freedom Bound, and, of course, Chief Steve. Now, I want to start this half hour with a discussion not on father flatulence and other liberal clergy, because they've always been exempted from the rules. But the fact is, conservatives have been told by the IRS that if you talk about politics, if you stand on principle, you can lose your 501c3 designation, and therefore your members can't deduct their contributions to your church. And right now we have well over 1,000, maybe close to 2,000 churches. They're saying the IRS, put up or shut up, arrest us, let's go to court. Can you address that, Dr. Keyes?
Sure. Can I start, though, by making one point with the chief? I want to stand with the chief because he corrected me rightly on one very important point. And that is that the actress who spoke up, that was actually a substantive statement she made, right? Not just in what she said, but in what she did. And the chief made that point, and it's exactly accurate. It's correct. She exampled a kind of courage that should be taken seriously. And I wouldn't want what I said about, not just dealing with folks because they're actors and actresses to stand corrected by the point he made, that when any individual stands up and shows that kind of courage, that deserves our attention. And I think that's true. So thank you, Chief, for that correction. I'm sorry, Stan.
Well, let's get back to the churches, because I think they're doing exactly the same thing. We had Pastor Dixon here in town that lost his church, that lost his house, that lost his ability, and basically lost his health because he was an early guy to stand up and say, we do not report to government. If we are true churches, we don't report to government, and we don't have to do government spitting. And now we have exactly that happening here, and I laud these 1,000 or 1,500 or 2,000 pastors, and I think it's about time. Go ahead, please.
I agree. One of the things that I have done for many years, as you probably know, is try, as I went around talking to people and in the churches and amongst conservatives, to just knock in the head this silly notion that the Constitution requires that our faith and religion and beliefs be kept out of politics. That somehow there's this separation of church and state in the Constitution. Lie number one, that is not true. It is not found there. In fact, what the Constitution does is make it perfectly clear that any questions that are affected by piety are to be decided by the states respectively and by the people. It's forbidden to the national government to deal with those issues. So they relied on federalism to make sure people would be able fully to exercise their liberty. That also goes very deep in our heritage, Stan. Because if you go back and look at the Pilgrims and other folks who came to America in the first place, people say, well, they came seeking freedom for their religious views. Yeah, but it wasn't the freedom to just keep it all quiet and keep it out of government and all. That's a lie. They came from a place, the Pilgrims, for instance, in Europe, where they had the ability to go to church and do things within the private realm over in Holland after they had fled from England, right? Why did they come to America then? Why did they pack up what were, in many cases, successful businesses and households that were doing well and so forth and so on, to come to a wilderness? They did so because they wanted to live in a community that reflected what they believed that God requires, where the laws would reflect it, where the government would be conducted with respect for it. They considered that to be part of the free exercise of religion. And so this whole notion that somehow, when it comes to government, you leave God out of it, that violates the understanding of free exercise on which the country was founded. That's step number two. And the other thing that really bothers me, and I'm glad folks are waking up, but in terms of the exercise, the proper exercise of their conscience and their faith and their appeal to one another on the basis of faith in politics. I am so pleased that's happening. I feel like, gosh, Lord, thank you. That's a great grace to be moving people with, I think, the courage of Christ in coming forward in this way. It's beautiful to see. But I also have to say that this all involves two things that I think we must recognize as interrelated, because it's no accident that the instrument of intimidation, the instrument that has been used to try to back people away, and has done it successfully, by the way, too. Both the combination of the IRS and the ACLU and these people have created a climate of intimidation. And here we had a Supreme Court saying you shouldn't do things that have a chilling effect on speech, and yet this combination has had a freezing effect in terms of the exercise of conscience and the respect for one's faith-shaped conscience in the political arena. So it to me also points out one of the great flaws of the whole income tax system. It's a system that is premised on a violation of our rights. The whole fact that we are being compelled and coerced to provide evidence against ourselves. The whole mentality of the system starts from a place where the respect for unalienable rights has been discarded. And then as an instrument, it is used to destroy another fundamental right, which is, in the true sense of the term, the free exercise of religion. And so I think this day was a day that I hope started to awaken people so that they will act in such a way as to stand on their rights, which is what the pastors did. That's what you got to do if you want to hold on to them. You can't get all intimidated and stop doing what you have the right to do. If it's right to do it, you do it, because that's why you have the right. And so they did, and that's beautiful. And second, I hope it'll wake people up to the fact that the IRS is the instrument of choice for the destruction of our unalienable rights. And when they expanded it in this decision they took on Obamacare with Robert's help, that was another signal of what they mean to do. This is an arm of the government that, because of our carelessness, in my opinion, is now operating outside the boundaries of due process, constitutional constraint, innocent rather until proven guilty assumptions of the common law and due process. It stands apart from all of that. And any such lawless instrument at the end of the day represents the destruction of our liberty. So I think that this day, I hope, will be a starting point for the boldness that's going to be required to restore our proper respect for the requirements of the doctrine of liberty the country is based on.
Brant?
Okay. First off, while I agree with everything, Alan, that you say in principle, there are certain elements of law that preclude some of the conclusions that you come to. In the first place, the income tax is coerced, agreed. It is not compelled. It is legitimately and genuinely voluntary, and therefore the IRS falls under civil law, not constitutional restrictions. It is not an agency of government. It is a private corporation. Okay, so coercion is there, but not compulsoriness, and that's why they get away with it, because it is under civil law. Anything voluntary is not under constitutional law. Now, having said that, the issue here is you have thousands of pastors, bless their hearts, that are basically going at the IRS restrictions on political endorsements by saying, we're going to endorse, and we're going to make you sue us, and then we're going to take it into court, and we're going to force the Supremes to make a ruling on it. And unfortunately, they're going to lose. And the reason they're going to lose is very simple. There is nothing that requires the church to be registered with the Internal Revenue Service. The church is completely immune from Internal Revenue Service restrictions. However, what a church does is it says, I want to give my parishioners tax deductions for their contributions to the church. Once they file with the IRS to become a 501c3 nonprofit corporation, they have taken on a privileged status. That privilege incurs certain liabilities in law. And one of those liabilities is that the IRS gets to tell you what you can and cannot do. If you don't obey the IRS restrictions, they take away the exemption, which is not, you're not entitled to an exemption. An exemption is always granted. And in this case, it's granted by the IRS conditionally. So they want the exemption, they have to obey the rule. If they go against the rule, IRS isn't going to sue them. IRS is just going to take away the exemption. Then they could try and sue the IRS and they will lose, because exemptions are not entitlements. What we really want to see is the churches say, I don't want your stupid exemption, and my parishioners, you should contribute because God says to tithe, not because you get a tax deduction from the IRS. Now, that would be a different story. Then they can go out and they can endorse anybody they want. The IRS can't do anything. But as long as they are seeking the tax exemption granted by the IRS as an instrument of the federal government, not a federal agency, they're going to run into this, and they're not going to win. As much as in principle, I love what they're doing, they're going to lose.
Well, can I say one thing, though? Yes. Because I understand what Fred is saying, and I believe that as a matter of legalism, if I may say so, that is correct. But you cannot say that if I pass a law that says, if you don't do X, Y, or Z, I'm going to kill you, that because you can make a choice to either die or do what I tell you, your action is voluntary. That defies our natural common sense, and therefore it defies a fundamental principle of natural law. So that if what you're saying is contrary to natural reason, then it is contrary to natural law for you to follow that reasoning. And that's what's happened in our so-called legal system with respect to this. Because, of course, you're saying, well, they don't say that they're going to put a gun to your head. No, but we all recognize that if somebody kidnaps your child and says, I'm going to harm them, that's not voluntary. If someone is stationed in such a way to burn down your house, to burn down your business, that's not voluntary.
They're not
so
doing
if I
any
can
of
do
these.
the same, well,
all they're saying is,
if they can do the, let me finish. If they can do the same thing by other means, so that if you don't do as you're told, you will lose your livelihood, lose your business, have your house taken away, so forth and so on. Don't tell me that decision is voluntary. That defies natural reason. It's not voluntary. It's coerced. And if and coercion and compulsion, this fine distinction you make, may exist in the fabricated fictions of this law, because that's the only way they can get away with it. It does not exist for natural reason. When I coerce you, successful coercion is compulsion. And that's not a distinction. It's simply an observation of events. So I'd have to beg to differ with you. From the point of view of constitutional law, the government's action must be constrained by right in every case. That's the whole premise of the Declaration, because the government exists to secure these rights. So that when the government acts in such a way as to destroy rights, acts contrary to the claim of natural right, then it acts beyond its boundaries, essentially. So this notion, which Roberts tried to rely on, that there's something inherently unlimited about the taxing power, is absolutely an abandonment of the whole concept of limited government and constitutional government. And I think they were right to, he's right to see it in the whole way that the income tax system has been conducted, because that's what it represents. It's why I've been opposed to it. I believe it must be abolished, or we shall never again be free.
By the way, there's also selective enforcement.
Brent, and they leave me alone.
Brent, hold on a minute. There's also selective enforcement, because they don't enforce this on liberal, black, the Democrat churches. They only enforce it on white conservative churches, and that's another issue that will be brought up. Now, the fact is, we don't know. I think Brent brings up an excellent point. I think you bring up an excellent point, but I think that the IRS will be very hesitant to put their very existence on the line on this issue, because in this environment, that might be their death knell. That's just my opinion, but none of us knows for sure. Chief, you have a thought on this?
Sure. Well, based on my training and experience, I fall back on the problem-solving steps. And the first step in to solve any problem is to identify the problem, which I believe is our oppressive tax code and the IRS. And so you mentioned earlier in the segment Reverend Dixon, who had his church taken away by the IRS.
And by the way, stop for a second. Reverend Dixon's people did pay their tax. Reverend Dixon didn't, he gave them voluntary contributions, but every one of them declared it and paid their tax. The government sent those people back the money they paid in tax and then sued Dixon for not taking the tax out. So, anyway, go ahead.
Well, today, Reverend Dixon Jr. has a church here in Indianapolis that is not a 501c3. 501c3, and so all the parishioners, they don't get a deduction for going there, but now he's at a disadvantage really because the other churches get this deduction and he doesn't. His parishioners do not, so it's not fair in that regard. Also, people that send their children to private schools, they have to still pay the taxes on the public school system, but then pay the additional fees to send their kids to public schools. So again, I'm sorry, private schools. Thank you, but again,
it's not fair, Steve.
What I'm trying to say is, instead of us nitpicking around, what the preachers should do, I believe what we should really be looking forward is a way to revamp and destroy and demolish this IRS tax code and get something that eliminates all these exemptions for everybody, like a consumption tax or something like that, to where it's not a point anymore and everyone can do what they want and also have more income to give to their churches if they so desire.
All right, now, Brent, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that, yes, Steve, you're absolutely correct on that. The basic issue here is that, and this is my final comment on it, but the basic issue here is that Dixon Jr. has a non-501c3 because he doesn't believe that the IRS should have control over his church. The straight and narrow path is generally rough road and difficult. Most people prefer the easy path, which is get the exemption and give the deduction. So you're right. His church has a lot more trouble, but his church operates much more on the principles of God.
All right. Well said, and I agree, and I happen to know him, and he's a fine fellow. His church is doing quite well, by the way. This is our final comment, and then comment on this and give a closing comment. The Supreme Court of Canada has just ruled you do not have to tell your partner if you have AIDS. If you have a disease that you could pass on to them that could kill them, you don't have to tell them that. I think that the United States Supreme Court, maybe now with Roberts having lost his mind, might make similar rulings and destroy any semblance of respect for the Constitution or God. I'll start with you, Alan.
Well, I think it's very simple, Stan. I'm sorry, I think a judicial ruling like that is a license to kill.
It is.
And that is, I don't even have the words to describe what a travesty of law and justice that is. So that because usually if I, with malice aforethought, right, do something that can harm you in your person or property, that is going to aggravate it. If it just happened, and it happened without my planning it or thinking about it or consciously doing it, then it's going to be a lesser charge. But if I consciously do something like conceal this fact, that then is going to result in possibly fatal harm to you, that's usually a serious charge.
It is in this country.
This guy is saying that it's not. That's a license to kill. I think that's, it makes me glad I don't live in Canada. Many things do, but that certainly does. But the truth is, are we looking at our future there, Stan? Because that's unconscionable.
I think that we are. By the way, it's not one guy. It's the entire Supreme Court of Canada. This was their ruling. And they can't be, I mean, that's the last word. Brent?
Well, and I actually am going to differ on this with you, Alan. But I don't take my position very strongly. I'm not absolutely sure on this. While I agree completely with you, it could be a death sentence. What we ought to have morals that are such that somebody who has HIV positive wouldn't think twice about whether or not to give that information to a potential sex partner. But we don't have morals. So the question is, should the government be involved in compelling people to do this? And I'm not certain that it is appropriate for the government to come in. You're right. This could be a death sentence. But we're talking about the principles of government, which is there to secure the free exercise of your liberty.
It's
the government
it's life
is supposed to come
and liberty. Life and liberty.
To come in.
So for the government to say that you don't have to be concerned about someone's life, I'm sorry, your liberty stops where my nose, and I know my nose extends a ways, where my nose starts. So,
Well, but there's a whole body of law out there that's destroyed by this reasoning, because that would mean that negligent homicide, where you do not take what anybody's common sense would say are precautions to prevent fatal harm from happening to others on account of your behavior. That's long-standing as a recognized principle that subjects you to criminal liability. So what are we saying here? That we're just going to take all that and toss it aside where homosexual behavior is concerned? Why? It applies to everybody else and other things they do. You own a swimming pool. It applies to you. And so forth. But it's not going to apply to their behavior? Why not?
No, there should not, see, there should not be an exceptional case. It should be an across the board one or the other. The question I have is whether the government belongs involved in such a determination between people rather than the people themselves. Now, I agree. I agree with you that this is a real travesty of a ruling. I'm just not sure that it's a wrong ruling.
Well, but wherever your judgment is going to lead to damage and harm to others, that up to and including their life, that may be a moral question, but it's a moral question that has always been subject to penal law, always. So why should we suddenly not subject it to penal law where homosexual behavior is concerned? It doesn't make sense to me, friend.
I couldn't agree with you more, and we're out of time, but I'm going to get a final comment from the Chief.
Just quickly, I'll agree with Dr. Keyes, and there are laws that protect us from people that are psychologically ill and need to take medicine. If they don't take it, the courts make them take it. Also with people with communicable diseases like tuberculosis and those types of things. So this would apply, in my mind, the exact same way. Our law should protect us from people like this.
On that basis, I thank Dr. Keyes, I thank Brent Johnson, I thank Chief Steve, and I thank you for your time spent with us here on Talk to Solomon. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.